The mist settling over Oxford is kind of Victorian. The fireworks have stopped exploding and the dogs no longer need tranquilizers. It's early November 2024. The US election is over and we now know the results. Welcome to the Internet Seriously. I'm Lucien Taylor in Oxford.
I'm Emily Taylor in Oxford.
And I'm Kieren McCarthy in London.
Hello. Coming up, Putin calls him courageous. The Guardian predicts a bleak outlook for the planet. Macron jokes about his convictions and the BBC calls him historic. What does the 47th President of the United States mean for tech? Next, this week, Emily and I, travelled to the Global Anti-Scam Summit in Washington. No coincidence there, following Google's announcement that they will be joining us as partners of the new global signal exchange. People are asking, what are we going to do with the data? And finally, a new report by Professor Kathy Sudlow calls for improved access to NHS patient data for researchers. Thank you. First of all, I'm going to say thank you for our producer, Katie, who's stepping in for Igor today. And we're going to be really kind to you, Katie, if anything goes wrong. My first test for you, Katie, is don't forget, everyone, to like and share. And coming up on the screen now are the like and share buttons. Please follow us. Please subscribe to these channels. And please listen to us on the podcast. But thank you very much. Well done there, Katie. Great. So first of all, I mean, really, we do have to kick off with the presidential election. Emily, President Trump, what does that mean for tech, really?
Gosh. Well, it's he's been called an unguided missile in terms of his policy consistency. And actually thinking back to the first Trump presidency, we saw for the first time a very strident public contest against China through technology. Do you remember the whole Huawei 5G debate, a series of sanctions eventually on semiconductors was the thing that finally did for Huawei in the United States, threats to allies if they didn't toe the line on Huawei and 5G.
That us?
Yes. And also talking about onshoring US chip capacity, hating TikTok, wanting to ban it. It all seemed completely insane.
Now, this is Trump 1.
This is Trump 1, followed by Biden, who actually made a lot less noise, but continued and amplified exactly the same policies. Onshoring chip capacity, sanctions on China, and also a ban on TikTok, if it threatened ban if it didn't divest.
Now that's the prequel. Before you come back, because I'm going to, Kieren, what's your thinking? Emily's got her view. Trump won, was pretty tough on China. Biden kept that pressure going. I was reading from Chatham House this morning that Trump 2 is promising to be there's still some conflict going to be happening there, and the tech, it gets caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, wherever there's going to be commerce and it's not American, there's going to be conflict. That's, I think that's the easiest way of summing up Donald Trump's view on life. If it's not American, if he doesn't get a piece of it, then it's a problem. So we'll see, and we'll see the impact that these proposed tariffs have. And we'll see how we'll have a big push on what the Republicans call freedom of speech, which can also sort of be sort of open doors to misinformation and slightly unpleasant speech. So I can't imagine the online world is going to get any safer, at least through the UK eyes. And we'll see. There will definitely be some kind of trade wars going on around tech for sure.
So okay, there's a couple of points there which I want to come back to Emily on before we go on to sort of freedom of speech and the complexities around that, because we know he's very bullish about that. Going back to the sort of tariffs thing. And the wars, really. I mean, Trump said he's going to end wars in 24 hours. When was he elected?
In more than 24 hours. So that's a big fail.
Well, we don't
one.
know. No, he's not been sworn in yet.
No,
let's
sorry,
not,
he hasn't taken
let's not set him up
right.
to fail. But he does say 60% tariff on China imports. I mean, that's like every bit of a car, isn't it? 150% tariffs if China blockades Taiwan. And he says they know I'm crazy. So he's playing on his own craziness.
And at the same time, he's said in the summer, Taiwan should pay the US to defend it.
Yes.
So, a typical Trump type of approach, which is saying one thing and then saying the exact opposite, saying, hands off Taiwan or you're going to get hit by even higher sanctions, 150%, or actually Taiwan should be paying us to defend it, suggesting that it's an open door to China. So which is it? Anyone's guess. But I think Kieran's right. It's like whatever favours US trade in the short term. I mean, there's a whole question, big picture, about whether the US approach to China on technology, which is one of containment and slowing it down through throttling access to vital US technologies, whether that containment strategy really will work or whether it will drive, spur on China to become self-sufficient on key technologies.
Now, that's very interesting because, Kieren, we were both in Singapore last week or a couple of weeks ago. We're looking at a different world. When I was last in Los Angeles, the streets are crumbling. The highways need fixing. The bridges are really suffering. And you drive around and you think this feels like it kind of some parts of it. I love America, but there's parts of it that feel like sort of old Mexico. Then you contrast that with Singapore. And the pundits are saying, actually, China doesn't really care about the tariffs. It's inoculizing itself against the tariffs by investing in 33 countries in Africa with open trade investment deals. It's putting tech elsewhere. It's building up tech dependency elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, the Trumpism is very short term and very transactional. And part of the reason that the United States has maintained this kind of superpower status for so long is it's often thought medium to long term, at least outside the country for sure. And that's what China is doing. China has built quite a strong, very strong block of support in a big chunk of the world. And you just look at, for example, when they started banning all the Chinese stuff coming into the US, they've just gone and created their own operating systems and created their own hardware. And that hardware is just as good, in some cases slightly better and cheaper. So China is definitely resurgent. And I don't think whatever Trump does, I think he thinks it will help, and it might in the short term, but medium to long term, I think we're going to see the Asian powers rise up, and America and Western nations are going to fall down the list when it comes to technology and economic growth.
Yeah, and Lucien, you mentioned our trip to Singapore. I was so struck by what Kieren was saying, really. The whole place felt so optimistic. So there was such a sense of belief in itself. And I felt like, Asia, we fixate on China for obvious reasons, but there are so many parts of Asia which feel very, very optimistic, and we seem to have lost our mojo in Europe and America, and it feels like a grief cycle. It feels like I feel like the US, it's an amazing country, a great country, and of course many people in America did not vote for Donald Trump, but he's had a sweeping success in this election. It is not marginal, it is massive. In the Electoral College, in both houses, everything. So are we seeing America's decline flailing around, going for isolation, protectionism, and trying to recapture those sort of heady days of the 1950s? Or is it actually going to experiment with this and come through stronger because it's got so much to give the world?
Well, they say that, Trump is a businessman, and businessmen try and make things clear and they go for deals. So he's going to run the whole of America like a business. He's got Elon Musk. He's promised him a great big job sort of reforming government and making it more like PayPal and make it more like Tesla. How does that contrast? That's clearly, Kieran, full of energy, full of strategy. Even if it's crazy strategy, it's strategy. And I will be the first to eat my words on free speech social media channels if it comes to light. But how does that contrast with the UK, who have done this reactive sort of Kamala Harris kind of, politics is about being boring. It's about being sensible and doing the sensible thing. Isn't it also about taking people with you and creating this sense of excitement, even if it's madness?
Well, I think what you have to, America is very different to the UK, and I know America pretty well. I spent 14 years there, and he came back to the UK 2.5 years ago. And I would never, I love America, and they will do remarkable things, and it will rocket, and Trump will pull some things out the way, and he will enable some things that, that would be constrained in an environment like the UK. So I expect to see amazing things. I mean, it's not like because I deeply dislike Trump's approach and philosophy to life that he, in terms of the wider country, him being there won't be a good thing. It will probably end up being a really good thing for some of these countries or companies. That's the truth. The UK is far more restrictive, particularly when it comes to finance. And that's one of the big problems that the UK has never got over and still hasn't, if you look at what the recent budget was. And we were talking about that last week. So I expect the US will thrive in this area in terms of commerce, in terms of tech. And I expect the UK will continue to dawdle along because it's now got extra tax and weight on it. And
on top of that, Kieren, the Prime Minister, the government picked a fight with Trump. They decided that Kamala was going to win, and they basically sent their troops over and argued against Trump being in government. Where does Trump was the great ally with Boris. They were going to work together and do deals together. Biden came in and said, hold on, calm down, everyone. The UK is not at all special. You're the back of the queue. We're talking to, and he said, our best friends in France. And it all sort of collapsed. Where are we now?
We are not in a great spot.
We've done Buckingham Palace. The Queen has kind of toddled along behind
They're going to be hit with tariffs too. That's the truth of it.
Yeah.
And we are not tying up with Europe, which would be the smart move if you just put it down on paper, would be to reconnect a lot more with Europe, because the US is not going to be making a special example of
Emily,
the UK.
do you agree degraded trade deals and relationships with Europe now? Trump's going to be less interested because he doesn't forgive, does he? He doesn't sort of
It's the whole sort of unguided missile aspect of Trump is all of these sanctions, all of these trade barriers, as Kieren says, are going to affect friends as well as enemies. We've already seen in some of the previous sanctions that Dutch chip manufacturers were hit, and then they have to be tweaked and all of this stuff. So. One little bit of hope I have about the Keir Starmer administration is that they've immediately reached out to European leaders, and sometimes a change of government can give everybody the excuse they need to kind of go a bit closer without losing face. But just one reflection on the US election, it reminded me very much of the Brexit referendum, because Kamala Harris had a very strong position in the summer. She was several points ahead, not only nationally, but also in the swing states. And they fell back on a real negative Project Fear type of approach. We never heard what her vision, her motivation.
You're saying she lost rather than...
I think she lost.
Rather than Trump winning.
And also the sort of co-opting kind of glamorous celebrities to tell people not to be stupid, effectively.
Right.
And that sort of
and they
categorising
don't like it.
All Trump supporters as stupid people and garbage. which was a gaffe by Joe Biden. But I think the whole kind of finger-wagging, lecturing type of approach that many progressives have, including the Labour Party here and probably myself and many so-called experts like me, that there is a sort of talking down and a taking for granted of the base and thinking, well, because I think this person is dangerous and has fascist temper. There are so many quotes from cabinet ministers in the UK who've called him a tyrant in a toupee, a fascist, a misogynist. Now they've got to eat their words and suck up to the guy because that's real fun. Politics.
Well, we've got to watch this space. This is from people who live in East Oxford, which is a battleground of sort of do-goody thinking from on high. So, very, very interesting stuff. So next up is we're heading off to Washington, funnily enough, for the Global Anti-Scam Summit. But before that, it's time for our Guilty Pleasure Online. I'm going to put it on you. Emily, Taylor, what are you... Last time your guilty pleasure online was the poll site for the American election.
Yeah.
You've now got nothing to do for 8 hours a day. So what is your replacement? I got a suggestion for your replacement.
Okay, so my
replacement
pleasure has been... So I have been refreshing the poll sites, but the election's over and it's not refreshing anymore. So now I do need to find something to fill those 8 hours a day.
So you don't know?
I've been listening to podcasts a lot.
Oh, right.
I've been listening to R1, which is excellent, and also the Rest is Politics US with Anthony Scaramucci, who I love, and Catty Kay.
He must be eating his words.
He's everybody's eating their words, and everybody's sort of like sober reflection and quite fearful. The most interesting voice I heard on that was from the historian Dominic something from the Rest is History podcast. And he was great because he really did give it the long view. So I think that's probably going to be my new guilty pleasure.
Thank you very much. So this week, we had travelled to the Global Anti-Scam Summit in Washington. And following Google's announcement 2 weeks ago that they will be joining us as the partners of our new global signal exchange, a joint venture with a Dutch company called the Global Anti-Scam Alliance. So we're going to have access to a huge amount of data, and people have been asking us, what are we going to do with the data? And so in Washington, we're going to be discussing our 5-step plan to tackle scams and abuse. So, Emily, our 5-step plan to tackle scams and abuse, let's step through it, measure it. That's a no-brainer, isn't it?
Yeah, you'd think that would be the easy bit, but in fact it's really difficult because there's an awful lot of data out there, but it's very difficult to know how to make sense of it. It's difficult to know what's up to date. And actually nobody... Even the very big, powerful companies who control an awful lot of our online life, not even they can see everything. So measuring it requires a lot of stuff to be in place before you can get a good measure.
Before we talk about the power of data, Kieran, people have been asking me, why share data with each other? Have you got any thoughts on the value of sharing data?
Yes, sharing data is how you really get things done. I mean, on almost every level, you could just sort of throw out any industry right now. We could talk about how using that data is going to make it work better. It's become a little bit like AI. You just say it. But the truth is, if you can get the more data you can get, the more sense you can make out of it. It used to be too much data caused paralysis. Now with AI and now with machine learning, more and more and more data, you can actually intelligently go through it and make sense of it and find patterns that would take us as humans previously an incredible period of time. It wasn't worth it. Now you can. So yes, the more data and the more intelligent sharing of that data for pretty much every sector is going to be useful and provide you with real insights.
Yes, I mean, for me, it's a no-brainer. But in the NHS just recently, and I'm going to inject our third topic here because I think it actually is pertinent here, a new report by Professor Kathy Sudlow calls for improved access to NHS patient data for research. Now, this is again about measuring it, and you can measure it in a sort of statistics environment, or you can measure things in real time. In the COVID outbreak, we were all glued to the data. Is it going up and is it going down? But the thing that gets me is, I worked in the NHS very briefly with a lot of sedatives in 25 years ago. There was a call for the United Patient Data Systems, and they were £1 billion disaster, investing in these colossal systems. Emily, what's this about?
Well, sharing data, like Kieran says, everyone talks about it, but hardly anybody does it. And there's lots of reasons why not. And I thought Kieren made a great point earlier about the UK feeling really stuck. And the NHS is sort of such an emblem of stuckness. What happened during the pandemic was, because of the kind of complete emergency, a breakdown of everything, a lot of things became possible that hadn't been possible before. So there was suddenly a huge amount of data sharing to try to actually save people's lives. And in fact, your own mother benefited from this, because for very acute patients, by collecting, sharing and correlating data, it was realised that some treatments really didn't work. Ventilating patients did not work.
Wow. Yes.
It tended to kill them. And some very cheap interventions could be incredibly effective, like steroids. That was found by data sharing, by looking at the mass. And it's not necessarily about getting one perfect line of data. It's about getting all of the data, warts and all, and correlating it with different things. And that's where you get the insights.
Yes, your father, infamous Oxford professor, inventor of the Oxford knee, your late father, he said to me once, I was saying, what was it about the Oxford knee? And he said, well, we invented that 2 decades ago. The difference was the data. We had somebody, Emily, tell the story of somebody who collected the data.
My father was a research scientist, so he was a researcher primarily. He worked with an orthopaedic surgeon. He developed the sort of mathematical modelling that show he understood the forces that applied in the knee, designed the bit, that designed the component. But then, because of his influence, they followed up their patients for 20 years. So when they went to go through the US Food and Drug Administration, which is very, it's a sort of, again, I would say a use of standards to block non-US products, took 20 years for them to get through, but they had 20 years of data showing more than 90% survival at 20 years and more than 90% were pain-free. If you don't follow up, if you don't collect that data, you don't know the results. You're just going on your gut feel, and that just doesn't cut it anymore.
Yeah. Before we move on to our step 2, and we're not going to plod through this slowly, I promise you, we're at step 1
of our 300
of our 5-step plan to tackle scams and abuse. We've just done measure it. Before I move on to step 2, it's time for our Tech Room 101. Myself, what is...
Oh, shall I ask you?
Yes, please do.
Or maybe Kieren should ask you.
Yeah, Kieren, you ask me.
Ask Lucien.
Lucien, what is your room 101?
I'm going to make him do that every time now.
Good. That was quite scary.
Okay, it's Boots the Chemist shop checkout systems. Okay, you get to the end of the queue. There's no humans there, and you've got to check out. And the systems are absolutely crap. Okay, you arrive there with your stuff from the chemist and you start checking out and it goes a red light and it's there and there's nobody there because it's a non-human mediated tech system. And there's then a queue building up behind me and they're all cross with me as a customer because I'm holding up them because they can't get to the till because the till is bloody blocked. And then a shop assistant passes. What's the matter? I don't know. I'm just a customer. Well, what's it saying? It says I've got paracetamol. Yeah, but paracetamol needs to be checked.
What a shock result in a pharmacy.
Yeah.
What a shock that somebody would be buying some drugs.
Yeah. Now, I heard something about the Boots director or something resigning or something this week. I hope so. Anyway, those shop till systems, they're okay if you're savvy, if you know it, but I always get stuck because it's always alcohol or paracetamol and I get stuck and they just don't know it. They've obviously never encountered anybody.
Are the two connected in any way?
Alcohol one day, then paracetamol the next.
That's
well,
right.
Sometimes ibuprofen, depending on.
That's right.
Sometimes
you can,
some Alka-Seltzer works a treat.
Yeah, kick somebody when they're just being quite, open and candid about their
Sharing.
stuff.
Thank you for sharing,
just you wait, you guys.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I hate those automated tills as well because I actually like talking to people in shops.
But that's expensive. What about the stockholders,
I
Bob?
feel like it's the worst sort of inhuman approach to tech. It's sort of like, oh my God, we're losing market share to online. Let's make the shopping environment in real life like online. No, make it different to online. Make it nice. Make it all the things that we lose in the online experience, like seeing things and talking to people.
Okay. Step 2 of our 5-point plan to tackle scams and abuse is make it a sport. What do we mean by make it a sport?
Well, this is our league tables and leaderboards, Lucien. So we do lots of learned policy papers and they can be hundreds of pages long and they are excellent, aren't they, Kieren? They're excellent.
Superb.
They're superb.
Just to explain.
It strikes me, though, that hardly anybody reads a long document anymore. Yeah. And really, some of the things that you are trying to do, if you're in policy research, is you're trying to show what works and you're trying to stimulate good practices rather than bad practices. And we found that leaderboards and league tables really help.
I think that's important to say. They are like football league tables.
They're like football league tables, so you can follow your team and it's easy to understand what you're looking at. It's like a list of entities and how they're doing.
So who are we looking
in comparison? At the moment, we've been looking at top-level domain registries.
So these are the verticals in what we call the supply chain of the internet.
Correct, and they're relatively high up in that supply chain because they control a whole domain each. So they have quite a lot of power, particularly at the country code level, to define their own policies. And despite having the same policies at the generic level, the .coms and the new top-level domains, there is actually a very wide range of performance when it comes to abuse levels in each of those top-level domains. So we just rank them in order: who's got the least abuse per domain, who's got the most abuse. And we've already seen, not naming any names, but we've already seen that it's having a magic effect because people are not happy with where they are in the league table, particularly the middle ranking ones, and are like, well, we want to do better. And it helps them to think about what is possible from up at the top of the league and also, what they might need to change to improve.
And so, Kieren, that gets us on to the third point, which is engage with the change makers. If we're talking about a league table, you've got 10 organisations at the top of a league who are doing well and 10 organisations at the bottom of the league who are doing badly. Who are the change makers there?
Well, it depends. I mean, typically it's the people that have focused in on it, or at least who value, being nearer the top. I mean, so the thing I like about this approach is that it's good comms. People always have 1,000,001 things to do, and it's what you concentrate on. If you can show people that actually, compared to other people in your industry, compared to what they're doing, they are doing a little better than you, then in a good way, that makes people think, well, hang on, why are we not doing better? Yeah. And then that is what engages people, and they look at things a little more closely.
And we have been engaging with the change makers. We've been talking to the people at the top who have said, we're delighted, and we've then said to them, can you help us achieve some change? Can you tell us what you're doing that's so good? Alternatively, the organisations at the bottom tend to divide into two groups, I would suggest. One are the people who are like, oh God, we didn't really know we were this awful. What can we do? Which takes us on to step 4, which is to provide them with tools to help them improve their position. Or they're the ones who don't care.
Yeah, and you often, and I've talking to friends and colleagues in the ICANN environment. There's sometimes, particularly from the domain industries, there's sometimes a lot of frustration. It's like, hey, everybody's beating up on us, but we're here and we actually believe in this model. And sometimes the worst performers just don't show up, and you never hear from them and you never talk to them. But then there is also, I think, a key point you mentioned is that this is a distributed system, and sometimes the control and the customer is way, way, way downstream, and people might not actually know what their performance is relative to each other. And some of the performers right at the bottom of the table are quite surprising because they're large companies with a lot of resources, and possibly they just don't know their risk profile, I would say, being kind.
So this is what we're going to be talking about in Washington next week, Kieren. We've looked at what football does, and we've tried to get people really excited about their position. Nathaniel Gleischer from Meta said in a great speech to Global Anti-Scam Alliances ago, we need to do little things, lots of little things. And in the fraud attack chain, you have registries, registrars, ASNs, hosting providers. You then have social media providers who are sharing bad links inadvertently because they're not looking at the intelligence enough. Finally, everyone's dealing with this data, this massive data, but nobody's really measuring the data itself as well, the fidelity of the data. So what we're doing is, step 4 is providing tools for all those individuals in those verticals to provide feedback about the data. Was it helpful?
It's a good model. I was actually recommending this to one of the top people at Ofcom last week, who was looking at the Online Safety Act and how to deal with content and how to talk to tech companies, and the government's going down a route where it's thinking about putting more and more controls. And I said, look, you're not going to be able to do that. You need to get the tech companies to want to do it themselves. So I recommended to Ofcom that they think about doing league tables with the data that they've gathered, because nothing's going to annoy a tech company more than their rival doing better than them. So
great.
That was my recommendation to Ofcom.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Kieren. I'm going to ring them up next the week after next and try and flog them our league tables. And I've patented them.
Coming soon is the registrar league table, and then shortly followed by ASN.
Now, registrars are?
Registrars tend to be the retailers. They're not always the retailers, but they are the downstream providers that tend to be more like a shop. So it's a bit like a supermarket versus a manufacturer. So you go into a supermarket, you might buy lemons, you might buy oranges, you might buy a mop and bucket.
Now, the registrars, tough bunch, aren't they? When you see them at a group in ICANN.
It's a tough business to be in because it's really low margin. It's completely commoditized, so it's very difficult to differentiate at the domain name level. So this is a really interesting sector because, yes, one or two have incredibly high volumes and therefore margins. A lot of them have diversified businesses, so they are in hosting, they are in other services, but not all of them. And they are being asked to do an awful lot with very little resources.
Yes, interesting one to watch, because then we move on to also hosting providers who are making a much bigger margin. But we suspect that some of the registrars are also hosting providers, and they're not really talking much about that. But Kieren, we know the registries, the .coms, the .uk's all have sort of an entity at the top, that is ICANN. Who do the hosting providers have at the top that we can go to and talk to?
They don't really. They tend to have sort of industry organizations that they use for lobbying, but they don't tend to have that kind of coordination. And there's sort of an interesting aspect to that part of the industry. They don't tend to work together so much on that.
So it's like the invisible man, isn't it? The sort of, most people think they know who the hosting companies are, but I don't. It's really difficult to find out. Something we've been struggling with in our ecosystem discovery aspect of our research at the moment is like, who are the resellers? who are the hosting providers,
Yeah.
and how do they intersect with other
Yeah,
aspects
I've
of the
said for the
industry?
longest time, there needs to be like proper economic analysis of this very large and quite important market. And no one, even the people on the inside, don't really understand what the market looks like. And time is ripe to figure out what on earth this market looks like, because no one's quite sure.
Thank you both. That's a job we've taken on. We're going to come back to that. Our ecosystem discovery is our next big project, which we'll probably be talking about quite soon. We're out of time. Before I finally wrap up for today, we haven't done our fifth step, which I'll end on. Voice of God. Do we have a comment of the week?
There's no comment of the week.
Right, that's it. That was really classy.
The key is preparation.
No, this is a live show. This is great. I'm expecting 3 comments of the week next week, because I know there was a lot of comments. There was a lot of comments.
Yeah, we had a lot of comments a few weeks ago.
Finally, before we wrap up, don't forget to subscribe to our channels, like or share if you're out there. We need you. We need to build this community. Gotcha. So finally, our 5-step plan to tackle scams and abuse. Number 5 is celebrate success. I don't think I need to explain any more. See you next week.